When humanity finally left its cradle on the third planet of the Sol sector, it began to stretch out to each of the stars. This was nothing new. All sentient species did this, and they usually colonized the nearest planets they could, those which they could survive on. What surprised everyone was the fact that humans had a strange way of colonizing. They would stretch out with large ships that were armed to the teeth with all sorts of weaponry as they made their way to the planet and then land the ship on the planet, knowing full well that they could never take off again. This was odd. However, as we watched, humans began to build great cities through these ships, as the ships would open up vents and do what they needed to, as they called it, terraform said planet into an M-class planet. This would make it more than sustainable for human life, but also for others as well. Humans preferred to do this to each of the planets, no matter how unforgiving the atmosphere was. In some cases, there wasn't even an atmosphere, and they still colonized the planet, still preferring to go out in their suits, however, still using these massive warships to land on the planet and use them as a base of operation. This surprised us and confused everyone, as we didn't understand why the humans would need such a massive vessel with such large weapons, and why they would simply land it on the planet and use it and not just release their shuttles to colonize the planet at large. So we sat and we watched. We watched the humans spread out with each of these ships to each of their planets, each of the planet's satellites in their sector. And when they were done, they had finally reached out beyond their sector to at least one sector in every single direction, and colonized at minimum one planet on each one, and 2 separate satellites. It was around this time that the galactic community at large introduced themselves fully to the humans. We'd found out that some of the species had done backdoor deals with the humans, as they call it. Still not sure what that means, but we're pretty sure that it meant something against galactic law. This, at first, gave us a reason why the humans had spread so far, so fast, in such a short amount of time. In fact, once the humans had achieved spaceflight and were able to start mining minerals out of their own asteroid belt, then the production of these massive ships went up tenfold, and it only took one of their years, a solar rotation around the sun, to create one. Their autonomous robots would go into the asteroid field, mine it for whatever they needed, breaking the chunks down into smaller pieces, then bringing the chunks back to large space stations, which they were smelted down and formed into whatever materials they needed to build it. Then the same type of drones would simply take the pieces and build the ship next to the space station. This whole process, as stated before, ended up taking about a year. Eventually, they moved some of these stations even closer to the asteroid belt, and production got even faster with these large ships. It became noted that each of these ships was strange to us, more so than you would think, as they were much more than colonization ships. We still didn't understand why these ships needed such powerful weapons on them. We scanned each of them, and though we could not get through their hull, it was easy to see the type of weapons they had. Many different ports for weapons, direct fire weapons, that is. Many point defense weapons for incoming materials. And what was either a spot for missiles and torpedoes to be launched, or for escape pods. But it was difficult for us to tell which one was which. This being said, it was not until the humans had finally reached the edge of the borders that we would allow them to, as it is galactic standard to allow each species to go one sector beyond their home before any type of stance is against them. We told them that they must stop, and they cannot start colonizing these empty worlds. The humans didn't listen, and simply said, "You did not colonize this planet, which means it's free to colonize." We warned them that this was against our laws, And the humans simply said, "It's not against ours. We were here first. If you wanted this planet so bad, you should have colonized it." When we informed them that we were going to colonize them, even though it would take approximately 10,000 of their years to do so, they simply stated, "In 10,000 years, we'll have an entire population." We could not abide by this, as reaching into someone else's territory is an unofficial declaration of hostilities. So, the first central species to engage the humans decided to take back this one simple colony. They arrived at the planet. The Aragna came across the planet and simply stated for the humans that they had to leave. They didn't have a choice. The humans responded, "We do not negotiate with terrorists." The Aragna stated back, "We are not negotiating. You will leave or you will die. You have 24 of your hours." At that point, the human warship, as we thought it was landed on the planet and simply used as a base of operation, began to ignite its engines once again and lift it off the planet. The Aragna didn't understand, how could something so massive be able to lift off a planet so easily? The ship turned its nose towards the outer atmosphere and scorched the planet beneath it, just about destroying every single structure that was in the general area as it boosted its way out of the atmosphere. The Aragna ships did not wait, and they began to fire on the human battleship as it just became orbital. It barely scratched the paint. The human battleship began to unleash with all sorts of salvos of weapons. It never changed the direction or pitch of the direction it was going. The weapons simply rotated and began to fire. Massive amounts of metal were launched out at speeds almost unbelievable, at a high percentage of the speed of light. Other weapons came out, missiles, torpedoes, even the point defense systems, if they were close enough, began to fire back at the Aragna ships. The Aragna ships fired their main weapons, and they barely even touched the side of the human ships. They didn't even see if the impact made the ship shudder as it continued its ascent. And once outside the pull of the gravity well, the human ship turned. The captain of the Aragna flagship shook in fear. The human battleship began to charge up a central weapon, and it fired a massive bolt of energy right through the center of the Aragna fleet. The front of the human vessel was glowing as this gigantic laser turned off. However, this did not stop the other weapons from firing as well, as it was clear to see that the fusion drives were pushing the human ship straight towards the rest of the Aragna fleet. Without skipping a beat, the Aragna charged the lines, attempting to fire all their weapons into the human vessel. However, it seemed that their projectile weapons would simply reflect off the hull and bounce off into the stratosphere, some of them bouncing and going straight down to the planet. And each of these that fired, that the shots ricocheted down towards the planet, ended up into a full volley of the humans. It seemed that they were picking off any of those that dare threaten the planet below. The Aragna, realizing that they had been completely outgunned, turned and ran, but the humans did not stop firing. They continued to fight off the Aragna until the Aragna got away from the gravity well far enough to activate its jump drives, and they blinked out. The Aragna told the galactic at large what they had faced, and no one could believe them. It wasn't until the video was shown of the single human battleship taking out an entire Aragna battle group, save for 5%, 4.8 if you want to be specific, remaining. Those remaining, many of them retired in shame, as they did not ever want to face the human vessels again. When they realized that the sheer danger they were in, the galactic at large decided to send a message to the humans. and they would end up ambushing one of these massive ships to show that they could simply jump in and take the ship out, as a warning to the rest of the humans to stay where they were and to not even think about threatening the galactic at large. A single ship was chosen. It took months for the planning to be complete to figure out which ship would be by itself on a patrol far enough away that the other human ships would not be able to reach it. They settled on one, and as they blinked in, on the side of the ship it was clearly legible to read ESF Poltava. Just as they were jumping in, the Poltava turned its weapon systems. Most of the fleet had not even jumped fully into normal space yet, as the Poltava began to fire its weapons towards the enemy fleet. They gave no warning, no quarter, and simply fired. It wasn't long before space itself was filled with projectiles flying back and forth. Most of the sentient species activated their energy shields, believing that they could simply deflect any of the incoming human rounds, and in a way, they were correct. However, they forget Newton's third law. For whatever action, an equal opposite reaction. The force of the human rounds hitting the side of the shields, if the shields held, would simply rock the ship in the opposite direction at the same speed that the projectile came in. There was obviously changes when it came to mass, but it didn't matter enough to the crew, as many of them were crushed against their bulkheads, and most of them would die splattered against their own consoles. Many of the ships recovered would find that if they were struck on the ventral side, the spines of even the captain were crushed, as the entire body was put under immense pressure. This did not stop the assaulting force, though, as they fired their main guns into the Poltava. The Poltava did something that no one expected. It simply rolled as it began to fire all its weapons. And as it rolled over again and again, it was giving its weapons time to cool down as they fired again and again and again and again. And as it continued to roll and got out of visual sight of the enemy fleet, it would simply stop its weapons, allow them to cool off. If they had to be repaired or rearmed, that's when they would do it, and then they would continue to roll back around and fire again. While this was going, the enemy fleet fired as much as they could into the cells. They would realize very quickly that those were not escape pods, but instead those were simply more and more missiles and torpedoes ready to be fired. And fire they did. Many of the torpedoes the enemy fleet tried to shoot down on their way in, and they all realized far too late that this ordnance was very well armored against any type of point defense. Each of these torpedoes and missiles would crash into the ship and burrow itself deep inside before exploding, in many cases causing secondary and tertiary explosions all along the ship as it set the atmosphere on fire inside, and the ship was immediately disabled and or destroyed. The enemy fleet, when it started, numbered over 400 against 1. Before the last 20 ships pulled away, it was screamed across the radio from the last surviving commander, "What the hell does it take to kill this fucking thing?" The humans received this message as well, and simply laughed. Later on, the humans sent an envoy out to the stars to tell the rest of the universe that they would no longer be expanding beyond too much borders. They would simply choose a few other planets, a few other sectors, and that was all. It was believed that humans would not need to expand beyond this, and if they did, they would simply go and work in other territory. The community was confused as they realized that this was very, very civil for a race that built ships that were so dangerous. The Poltava, even though it didn't get away unscathed, was able to face off so many ships and survive. The community did not understand why did humans insist on battleships Not until when they posed this question to the human ambassador. The human ambassador looked him square in the eye and said, "Better to have and not need than need and not have. Besides, considering how you folks say hello, I'm just glad we had him."